Welcome to the Flippin Health Podcast, where we turn medicine on its head, flip it upside down, shake it all about, and see what comes out. We're going to challenge convention and change medicine for the better.
Flipping Health, we're here with Catherine Crofts. Catherine, tell us about yourself. Who are you?
Hi, I'm a pharmacist, have been for about 20 years in New Zealand. Now an academic, teaching pharmacology to undergraduate health science students, but mostly I'm a researcher in high levels of insulin and metabolic health and metabolic disease prevention.
Well, that sounds complicated. So how did you even get into that?
That's a long story, but pretty well. All of my working career as a pharmacist, I've wanted to get people off medication, optimise their lives, optimise their health, maximise their quality of life, and minimise medications. And just sort of after a triathlon series where you could actually see the physical activity and the health gains these women were making, they were mostly middle-aged women, mothers, carrying a few extra kilos, not very happy, and they were getting into an entry-level triathlon. It was a 300 metre swim, a 10k cycle, and a 3k run or walk that could be done as an individual or as a team. But it was just a way of these women for getting in. And you could just watch the health gains. So it took a wee while to get together a research question and find a supervisor, which actually was you at that point, Grant.
Right, so this is the master's degree,
that was my
Masters of Health Science, looking at...
Well, it actually was a Masters of Philosophy because I already had the postgraduate diploma in clinical pharmacy, but couldn't find, the pharmacy school couldn't find supervisors for that sort of thesis, and this is what I really wanted to study.
Oh, that's right, okay, so you wanted to get into this activity and
so
fitness
I want to get
stuff.
into activity and fitness and move away from how can we use lifestyle to get people off medicine. And it's just grow from there.
So it's interesting because you did that thesis and then you went away.
Went away because I was trying to get, my husband would not let me do a PhD without a scholarship.
Right, so then you...
So it took me a couple of years to get the scholarship.
And then the scholarship, I think you got from the Heart Foundation.
Yes,
which
National Heart Foundation New Zealand, thank you very much.
And what was your first topic?
My first topic was going to look at cardiorespiratory fitness and metabolic syndrome, because what we saw from the master's thesis was that women were racking up large amounts of physical activity, but only on 2 or 3 days of the week, which meant they weren't actually meeting New Zealand physical activity guidelines, but their health was still improving. So it's a case of maybe it's how fit you are, not the amount of activity that you do. And if you can rack up lots of minutes in the weekend warriors, maybe that's just as good for your health as trying to do 30 minutes a day every day on 5 or more days of the week.
I always felt cardiorespiratory fitness is a much better measure of activity than a sort of cumulative weighted moving average record of what you've been doing rather than just the last week's what you've been doing.
Yeah, so that's what the intention was, but starting to do the background reading on that, metabolic syndrome, trying to unpack metabolic syndrome, led me into insulin resistance, trying to unpack insulin resistance, led me into the, in academic terms, we keep talking about trying to find your gap in the literature. I didn't find a gap, I found a big black chasm of hyperinsulinemia and trying to understand what the impact of insulin was on metabolic health and disease processes.
Right, and at the same time we were challenging you at work each day with the idea of low carb and ketogenic diets and what role those had?
Yes, because so when you Grant, when you came back from Pacific Islands talking about low carb, it was completely counter to everything I had been taught with orthodox medicine, and whenever it would have been but the early 2000s, the Atkins diet was in vogue, and there was a lot of studies coming out at that point in time, and most of them around the mainstream and what we had been taught and what we had been practicing, it was discredited. Everything was around low fat, and so I went through a big period of cognitive dissonance trying to reconcile what it was that you were talking about with the books, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, trying to reconcile that with everything I had done for the previous 10 years and everything I'd learned. I think I spent about 3 months being very grumpy but doing lots of reading.
Yeah, I think as far as lots of reading concerned, you probably take the world record for that of people that I've had anything to do with. At one point you had an EndNote library. For people who don't know, those are the sort of library of academic papers, including the papers themselves, of some 1,800 papers directly related to that topic.
Yeah, that's. I was looking at my EndNote library the other day because I keep building on it. I think it took me about 18 months of the PhD to get to 2,000 records, and 4 years on, I've only got another 1,600 papers on top of that. So
you're going hard at it.
I was going hard at it, but I didn't know what I could trust. I absolutely did not know what I could actually trust, who to trust, what to trust. I had to go back to fundamental physiology and go right back to first principles and build up from there, understanding the disease states, understanding the metabolic processes, to go, what can I actually really trust from here on in?
And then you ended up meeting a man called Dr. Joseph Kraft.
Yes, that was that's a lovely piece, because amongst all of this reading that I was doing, you're trying to search out the literature. You're trying to find what am I missing? Where's the gap? What am I trying to understand? And at the time, I'd got to the stage of trying to understand insulin and high levels of insulin, but there wasn't a lot of literature on that. And I worked out that we probably needed to extend looking at insulin response patterns following an oral glucose tolerance test for longer than 2 hours. And you go through all these standard academic search pathways, Scopus, Medline, Google Scholar. And I broadened my search even wider to bulk standard Google, trying to track down all sorts of obscure references. And a piece on a message board, I have not been able to find it since. There was an obscure piece on a message board somewhere that talked about this paper by a J.R. Kraft talking about hyperinsulinemia response patterns that was published in 1975. I tracked down that paper and went, this is exactly what I'm looking for. What else has this guy done? And not very much in the academic literature that I could find, but in the popular press there was a book, Diabetes Epidemic and You, self-published by Trafford Press. Second edition was 2011, first edition was 2008, and it's only 2013 at this point. It's a case of, he's done 15,000 oral glucose tolerance tests with insulin assays. These are the patterns that he's coming up with. He looks quite spry from his photo on the back page. I wonder if he's still around. Can I track him down? I tried emailing the email on the paper. No response to that. That email address didn't seem to be in use anymore. I tried a couple of other places, and eventually I emailed the publishers of the book and said, can you please pass my email and details on to Dr. Kraft, because I've got some further questions. And they did, and blow me, about 2 weeks later, he emailed back, and we emailed...
And he's in his 90s at this point.
He was in his 90s. Was he 89 or 90 at that point? But yeah, he's very late 80s, very early 90s, yes, in age. So, you know, the first few emails were very, very formal, and I'm asking questions. He's referring me back to pages in his book and pieces of the paper that I've got. But we made a phone call and chatted, and at the end of it I said, look, is there any chance you've got any of these results left? Is there any chance that I could have access to them and reanalyse them for my PhD? You went, yes, I've got a CD-ROM here, sitting here, I'll send it to you. It's got about 300 files on it. And so from 300 files, I'm expecting 300 individual graphs. No, there was 300, well, it wasn't Excel. The CD-ROM had last been copied in 1999 in DOS format. When it arrived, the next mission was getting IT to find a program that could actually translate this spreadsheet into Excel or something I could actually use. And one of the files had 15,000 oral glucose tolerance tests with insulin assay, including the height and weight and age of the participant. And height and weight, to be able to calculate out BMI, had never been published before. And it was fascinating to be able to start the analysis.
And you've since gone on to publish several papers from that data set, and really one of the worldwide leaders in this idea of hyperinsulinemia and hyperinsulinemia epidemiology now, right?
I don't know if I'm one of the world's leaders with understanding the Crofts patterns. There's lots of other groups out there who are looking at investigating hyperinsulinemia in different ways, but I'd like to think that I'm understanding these 3 to 5 hour oral glucose tolerance tests with insulin assays. Yeah, I probably am one of the world leaders with that.
And so then you went to Chicago and you met with Dr. Crofts while he's still alive.
November 2014. That was a wonderful trip. Very much treated like a member of the family, and with Dr. Crofts and his son Kevin. We had a wonderful, 5 or 6 days? Yes.
And Dr. Crofts since passed away, but now you're really the custodian of that data set. And
yes, I'm the current custodian of the data set. There's a lot of issues with it still. We still need to clarify and formalise ownership of it to be able to carry on future research, and I'm working through that process at the moment.
And just to summarise some of the major things about these Crofts patterns and diabetes, just tell us a bit about that. Without getting too complicated, by the way.
The concept of diabetes in situ.
Yeah, what is that?
So Dr. Crofts referred to hyperinsulinemia as diabetes in situ. Now, often we use the term in situ in the medical terms to imply a medical condition that's bad, it's pathological, but it may or may not occur. But this is the earliest point at which it can be diagnosed. It's like the other example is the change in cervical cells. When you start seeing some of the early changes, and we go, oh, this could progress to cervical cancer, but the cells aren't cancerous yet. But we need to do something. But if we do something about it now, we will prevent cervical cancer. So Crofts referred to the hyperinsulinemic patterns in the presence of normal glucose tolerance as diabetes in situ. This is not diabetes yet, because diabetes is high blood glucose levels, but if you've got high insulin in the presence of normal glucose tolerance, you've got a really high chance of this developing on to diabetes. But if you do something about it now, you can prevent the diabetes. And we've got other work, this paper done by Hayashi and colleagues in Japanese American men, that was 2011, I think, off the top of my head. They looked at these insulin response patterns slightly differently. They didn't do the full Crofts patterning. They stopped at 2 hours. But they showed that people who had an insulin level that peaked at 2 hours had a 40% chance of going on to develop diabetes, type 2 diabetes, in the next 5 to 10 years. But if your insulin response peaked at 30 to 60 minutes after the glucose load, you only had a 15% chance, if that, of going on to develop diabetes. So, that sort of suggests that if we look at people with normal glucose tolerance and see if we can work out who has high insulin at the 2 hour mark, if we can work with those people there and then and change their lifestyle, there's no medications we can use at this point. It's all about lifestyle. You change your lifestyle at that point, maybe you can prevent the diabetes.
So the prevention of diabetes is probably not going to happen at the point where you're diagnosed with diabetes, where you've fully lost control of your blood glucose. Your argument is that the progression of that is decades old at that point.
It's decades old at that point, and we think of all of the traditional thinking suggests that a lot of the damage that is done with diabetes is solely to do with the high blood glucose levels. And if we get the blood glucose levels controlled, no matter what the cost, it's going to prevent disease progression. Unfortunately, that doesn't work in practice, because we now know that a lot of the disease states that happen and the things like damage to nerves, damage to blood vessels, atherosclerosis, all of those can actually be driven by high insulin levels. So if you're just treating your blood glucose levels by increasing the insulin, you might be getting the blood glucose levels down, but you're not actually solving the problem. We've actually got to address the blood glucose and the high insulin levels at the same time. There's no medication around that can do that.
There's some good epidemiological support for this view in the glucokinase mutations, where it takes a higher blood glucose level to stimulate insulin secretion to lower it. So they're kind of like the glucose status naturally set higher in these people. And they'll have a HbA1c that's a percent point above everyone else, and yet they'll have the same rate of complications.
Yes.
But everything except retinopathy is a little bit higher, but much lower rates of complications than people with frank diabetes. And so the glucose in the absence of the excess insulin is doing relatively little harm.
And we also see it with often, this is a major plug for having an annual eye exam, especially as we get over the age of about 40, is you can actually start seeing the changes. You mentioned the retina. We can actually start seeing changes to the retinal capillary patterns in the back of the eye several years before you get elevated blood glucose levels. And that's actually potentially a sign of the high insulin. Again, they're starting to do the damage before we get changes to blood glucose levels.
So how do you know if you've got this high insulin, and what's your estimate in the population? Is this a major problem for the population? Are a lot of people walking around with high insulin?
There'll be a lot of people walking around with high insulin who don't know it. The population that I looked at, the study population, was a cohort taken between the 1970s and the 1990s. So we're talking about a cohort that's 20 to 40 years old. Of that cohort, depending on what your criteria was for high insulin and the presence of normal glucose tolerance, 50% of the people with normal glucose tolerance had high insulin, at least. If you extend out the criteria, it could be up to 75%. But on the conservative piece, 50% of people had high insulin levels.
Right, so if you take a sort of shopping mall food hall test, if you went down to the average food hall at a shopping mall and looked at the general populace walking around, are most of these people insulin resistant, and because of the way they're eating, are going to have high insulin and high glucose?
Well, one of the things that we have worked out is that, and this is from my analysis of the Kraft data set, if your BMI is over 35 kilos per metre squared, you've got a very good chance of being high insulin. All right, and unfortunately that test is not particularly sensitive or specific enough to be able to work out what happens if your BMI is under that. But if your BMI is over 35, you've got a good chance you've got an insulin problem. If your waist is more than half of that of your height, so if you take a tape measure and you measure it out to your height, fold it in half, you should be able to get that piece of cord or that tape measure around your waist with gaps left. It should have an overlap. Now, if you've got a gap and you can't meet in the middle, you've got a problem. So that is an indication.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice. I'm going to go and have a go at that.
Yes.
It's all right, Grant, I can tell by looking. I think you'll be okay.
Yeah, I'm 186 centimetres. I know for a fact my waist is 85, so there you go.
Yeah.
I was discussing insulin on the internet yesterday, and people were saying, well, I can't get an insulin test in New Zealand.
No, well, you can get an insulin test in New Zealand, but quite frankly, I'm going to say I don't recommend doing it. Right, the government does not fund insulin tests unless the request has come through from an endocrinologist and they suspect a pancreatic tumour.
Yes.
Okay, that's the only way you're going to get a funded insulin test in New Zealand.
I've heard somebody said there was a lab in Wellington that was doing it for $35.
You can actually show up to the labs in Auckland, and it's last count it was $40, so $35 in Wellington. That's about right, but it is privately funded. I'm still not going to recommend that you do it though. Okay, now the reason for that is most of the time this is being done, it's being done in a fasted state. So you haven't eaten anything overnight, you show up and you get your fasted blood test.
Fasted insulin.
fasting insulin levels are not very good at predicting whether you've got an insulin response problem. If you were to do it 2 hours after your meal, and or 2 hours after a glucose load, we've got a much better indicator of whether there's a problem or not. But one of the things that I've learned in my 20 odd years as a health professional is if it's not going to change the outcome of what you're going to do about it, don't measure it in the first place.
Yeah.
So if you're wanting to do it as an academic exercise, just to find out what it is, really, is it worthwhile? You're actually far better off going, let's have a cold hard look at your diet. If the sugar's creeping up there, if you're fond of the fizzy drinks or if you're fond of the refined foods, if you can't go more than 4 hours before having to eat something else, if you've got a sugar addiction issue, chances are you've got an insulin issue at this point in time.
If you get puffed easily, that sort of thing, I think.
Well, I don't know, I get puffed easily, I'm just unfit. I'm working on it.
Yeah.
But it's, but if you're already adopting a whole food, low starch diet, if you're already doing some of the exercise, sort of several times a week, you're pushing some weight. It's a case of what additional value are you going to get from it? Mm-hmm. If you know your health's not that great and you need to do all of these things in the first place, again, where's the value in doing it? So it's there, it's available, but at this point in time, I'm sort of going...
So technology is going to improve over the next 10 years and we're going to see all sorts of changes as well, aren't we?
Oh, yeah.
And I think if you do want a snapshot, the best one I can think of is the fasting triglyceride to HDL ratio for the 2-hour insulin, but we really would like to get that validated.
Yes, and I'd like to do the work as well. I just need some funding. It's
always.
And this is a simple thing. This is something that everyone gets tested because, the medical establishment is so big on cholesterol and lipids. It's just a standard test you get done even when there's nothing wrong with you.
Yes.
Everyone, as long as you're fasted for the 12 to 14 hours, everyone of a certain age probably has that data.
Yes.
And
I would actually make the argument that having seen some of the fasting to non-fasting differences for the average person, if I'm going to be given a choice of getting somebody in for a blood test non-fasting or not getting them in because they can't fast well enough for that period of time, just get your blood test done fasting.
Yes, you are going to see sort of extremes. Yes,
it's a case of, if you're on the cusp, then maybe we need to repeat it, or maybe we just sort of start adopting lifestyle changes now.
Yeah. Okay, so what we ask everyone on the podcast, Catherine, 5 questions. And the first is, what's good about the health system?
The New Zealand health system?
Well, that and in context of the global health system as well.
In context, one of the things I really like about the New Zealand health system is if you really need health support, there is something there available for you. It's got its limitations, but our GPs are readily accessible. We do have free healthcare at the hospital system, and it's a public system, so they do try and minimise costs and maximise access. So there's a lot going for it.
We don't add the stress of bankruptcy to your health.
No, it's a case of you don't have to have insurance to be able to access healthcare.
Okay, what's not working well enough?
I think one of the things that doesn't necessarily work quite so well is we've got an amazing system with ACC. If you have an injury, ACC is there to support you in so many ways, from your initial injury costs to
loss of income to rehabilitation
to you now need your house modified because you're now in a wheelchair, or you need your car modified. But the majority of people actually need the same sort of support through their illness, and so it becomes inequitable at that point in time. You get the support if you've had an accident, but you don't get the same support for an illness.
You might get a chronic condition like a stroke.
Well, even a spinal tumour, once it's removed, you're now paralysed from the waist down. If you'd had a car accident or fallen off a ladder or something and had the same injury, the amount of support you get is very, very different.
And this is related to the purpose of the law, which is to stop New Zealanders suing each other.
This is related to the purpose of the law, but at the same time, when you're the healthcare provider sort of going, you've got two people who've got very similar things, one from an illness, one from an injury, and there's a disparity. I get the purpose of the law. I appreciate that it's there for the accidents, but you can't help but feel for the people who've got the illnesses.
Yeah, right. Okay, so what about your own health? What do you do? What are the main things you pay attention to for your own health? Tell us a bit about that. People are always keen to know, and I'm actually keen to know.
Well, I try and work with my diet. We try and stick to a whole food diet. I try and limit the addition of processed foods, but as you notice, the word try is there. I don't always succeed, and I don't beat myself up about it. I try and get to the gym a couple of times a week to lift some weights, especially some of the heavy weights. I try and get outside for some cardiovascular exercise. I'm not very good at running. I keep ending up back at the physiotherapist, but I keep trying, and I keep trying to do it outside. And I've got hobbies as well that are, you've got to concentrate on them, which means that you take yourself away from day-to-day stresses.
And what are your hobbies?
Well, one of the things I do is I actually make patchwork quilts.
I know about that because you gave me one.
Yes,
very
I gave
nice
you
one.
one. Yes, but it's one of those things that if you don't concentrate very much on what you're doing, you do spend a lot of time unpacking and doing it again.
Oh, so you reckon that's sort of like a mindfulness exercise? Is that what it is? It pulls you into the moment?
It absolutely pulls you into the moment. I have referred to it previously as active meditation.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. So what do you find the hardest to do for your health that you would like to do more of?
Probably, my biggest weakness is I've got too much of a fondness for chocolate, but at least it is dark chocolate. I probably drink a little bit too much alcohol rather than that's good for you, and sleep is probably my biggest thing.
Oh, so tell us about the sleep thing.
Quality sleep is far more important than quantity of sleep. There's so many things like alcohol and chocolate that can actually muck up your sleep quality, but probably the biggest issue is the phone. Even though you've got the blue light filter on it, or an engrossing book, your mind starts winding back up again. It doesn't wind you down, and then that disrupts your sleep patterns.
So how much sleep would you get?
Quality or quantity? In quantity, I really do try and get a good 7 hours sleep a night, but some days you can have 7 hours sleep, but you're waking up non-refreshed. Other days you can have 6.5 hours, but you're waking up just absolutely refreshed. So focus should be more about the quality rather than the quantity.
Oh yeah, because I just ended up doing this PK 104, mind body medicine. I did the sleep module and had to do quite a lot of interesting research there, and I think there was two things that stood out to me. First was that at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, it was just 2% of people said they got less than 6 hours of sleep a night, and now in pretty much every developed country that's sitting around a third of people.
Yes, and you've got people, I can't think of any names off the top of my head, who are high achievers, and they talk about the fact that they only get 4 hours sleep a night, and if you want to get ahead, you should be limiting your sleep.
Oh yeah, like Donald Trump.
Sleep is for weaklings. I'll sleep when I'm dead.
But at the same time though, what we're learning now about sleep is that the deep sleep and the REM sleep, when you dream, is so important for restoring the body's health, and especially regulating cortisol and insulin responses. So if you're not getting good quality sleep, you're actually aggravating your hyperinsulinemia and your insulin resistance and making things worse.
Yeah, and one other thing I learned about alcohol is that its propensity to dial down REM or dream sleep and what that does to learning.
Yeah, I think that also has an impact on the amount of time you get into and spend in deep sleep as well, which is the deep part of non-REM sleep. So there's lots of different aspects of sleep that you need to get into. But yeah, alcohol's a real issue. Which
is a real reason why, although I'm qualified with a few degrees, I really didn't learn much at the university. Because at that stage of my life, as a young man in New Zealand, you end up doing a fair bit of drinking at these universities, and then so you probably don't learn as much as you're supposed to.
I was thinking about that because this could actually be a good thing. If alcohol really does help you forget, there's situations where that could actually be a psychological benefit, and there's situations where it's a sort of a...
It's not that fantastic for that.
Okay, so a couple of more things to finish up with. First of all, what's the number one thing you'd say to other people about health? Where's the primary target?
I would say at the moment, primary target is diet. It's especially around, we say that sometimes it's good to get people to focus on the positive things that they can do, eat more vegetables. But I would say at the moment, though, there is one negative behaviour that people really should stop, and that is the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages and highly refined foods. That is the number one thing I think people can do to help their health.
And the consumption of those are both going up.
Consumption of both of those are going up, and it's just going to have absolute impact on everything else. So if you can stop drinking the fizzies but it's not just the fizzy drinks. There's so many other drinks that are marketed as health drinks. They're just so high in sugar, including large quantities of pure fruit juices. I mean, even tonic water, if you're having a gin and tonic, it's got a similar amount of sugar in it compared to Coca-Cola.
Yeah,
so you actually need to look at some of these things as well.
Disappointing, really.
Yeah, and because some people may not pick that up, because I always assumed that tonic water, because it's bitter, was low in sugar.
Yes.
And it says water.
And yeah.
And it's tonic. It was originally designed as a health product to help the British in India reduce the risk of malaria.
But it didn't have sugar in it then. The sugar was put in it to make it appeal to people who weren't just drinking gin.
Right.
Right. Okay. But it's a case. I just went through a stage of being a voracious food label reader, and it was a case of, I saw this on tonic water. It was a case of, I was completely shocked.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you walk out of this door now and one single thing in the health system changed, what would that be?
That the health system supports a lot more than what it's doing at the moment, a low sugar environment within the New Zealand context. It's when you look at the food that's being fed to people in hospitals as patients in many places, it's not necessarily New Zealand but around the world, it's still high refined, high sugar. As health professionals, we need to be setting the example completely from within the healthcare system out.
And there's a good example of that in post-World War II England, with a shortage of food, of hospitals growing their own food, and actually interestingly setting those patients who were firm enough to helping in the garden.
Oh wow, didn't know that.
Interesting, yeah.
This podcast is brought to you by PreKure. Prevention is cure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. If you know someone who could benefit, please share it with them. Together, we can change medicine for the better. Change medicine for good.